If you had told me a broken acrylic nail could get me locked out of my own house in the middle of a snowstorm, I probably would have laughed, because even for my family, that would have sounded too cruel to be real. But that was before I stood on our front porch in sock feet, staring through frosted glass while my mother pulled the curtain shut like she was ending a conversation instead of leaving her daughter outside in 20-degree weather. The cold hit me so fast it didn't even feel cold at first. It felt sharp like the air itself had edges, slipping through my sweater, biting at my ears, creeping under my skin. Snow had already started piling up on the railing and gathering across the front steps, and I remember thinking with this weird detached calm, that Madison was still inside crying over a nail while I was out here trying to figure out how long a person could stand in the wind before their fingers stopped working. That was the part that finally broke something in me. Not just that my parents chose her over me again, but that they did it so easily, like it was obvious, like any decent family would throw one daughter into the cold if the other one's manicure had been ruined before a party. Madison had been getting ready upstairs for almost 2 hours, blasting music, trying on dresses, FaceTiming her friends, acting like the whole house revolved around her because honestly it usually did. She was supposed to be going to some winter formal after-party with people she spent all year pretending not to care about, and when one of her fake snowflake nails snapped off, she came downstairs like it was an emergency. She shoved her hand in my face while I was finishing an online shift at the dining room table, and said I had to fix it. Not asked. Had to. Because a couple of years ago I'd watched enough tutorials to do my own nails on the cheap. Somehow that had turned into another permanent job no one paid me for and no one thanked me for. I told her I couldn't. I was working. I had 10 minutes left on a deadline, and even if I hadn't, I didn't want to spend my Friday night rescuing Madison from the tragic consequences of her own impatience. She stared at me like I'd slapped her. Then came the tears right on schedule. Then my mom rushed in. Then my dad looked up from his chair long enough to decide I was the problem. Within 5 minutes I'd gone from saying calmly that I was busy to being accused of ruining Madison's night, embarrassing the family, acting jealous, acting selfish, acting like I was too good to help my own sister. That was how it always worked in our house. Madison had a feeling, and suddenly it became everyone else's responsibility. I had a boundary and suddenly I had an attitude. I should have known better than to think that night would be different. I should have known the second my mother said, in that icy little voice she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while being anything but, maybe some time outside will help you adjust your behavior, that she wasn't bluffing. And I should have known that when my father opened the front door, pointed to the porch, and told me not to come back in until I was ready to apologize to my sister, they fully expected me to break before the weather did. What none of them understood was that this wasn't the night they taught me a lesson. This was the night I finally learned one. The strangest part was that I was not even shocked right away. Standing there on that porch, hugging my arms against the wind, I was cold and angry and humiliated, but I was not surprised, and that is how I know my family had been teaching me this lesson for years before that night. People like to imagine that cruel moments come out of nowhere, that there is always some dramatic before and after, some clean line you can point to and say everything changed here. But families like mine do not work like that. They build their rules slowly, one excuse at a time, until the person carrying the weight starts mistaking it for normal. In our house, Madison was never just Madison. She was the fragile one, the special one, the one with big feelings and delicate confidence and important dreams, and somehow always the one who needed understanding. If she forgot homework, she was overwhelmed. If she snapped at someone, she was stressed. If she broke something, somebody else must have distracted her. And if she wanted something fixed, found, handled, explained, or absorbed, I was usually the person volunteered before I even opened my mouth. I was not the golden child. I was the utility child. The one who remembered appointments, covered mistakes, softened bad moods, cleaned up messes, and learned very young that saying no came with a cost. It was never framed that way, of course. My mother liked to call it maturity. She would look at me with that proud, performative smile she used in front of teachers and neighbors and say that Emily had always been the dependable one. Emily was so strong. Emily understood responsibility. What she really meant was that I was the one they trusted to go without. Madison got protection and I got expectations. Madison got comfort and I got lectures about being the bigger person. The worse she behaved, the more everyone rearranged themselves around her. And if I resisted that arrangement even slightly, I became the problem that needed correcting. I can trace it back to 100 small moments that looked harmless from the outside. Madison taking my sweater because hers did not match her outfit, and my mother telling me not to be dramatic. Madison borrowing my makeup without asking and crying when I got upset, which somehow ended with me apologizing for making her feel judged. Madison oversleeping and needing a ride, Madison forgetting cash and needing mine. Madison backing out of responsibilities and expecting me to fill in because she had a headache, a bad day, a stressful week, a social emergency, some new crisis that magically outranked whatever was happening in my life. By the time we were teenagers, everybody in the house understood the system, even if nobody said it out loud. Madison wanted. I provided. Madison complained. I adjusted. Madison spun a story. My parents endorsed it. I was not supposed to have reactions to any of this, and when I did, those reactions became evidence against me. Too sensitive. Too stubborn. Too negative. Too difficult. Never once did anybody ask why I seemed exhausted all the time. Never once did anybody consider that maybe the reason I kept pulling away was because I was tired of being treated like an emotional shock absorber with a driver's license. My father's role in all of this was quieter, which in some ways made it worse. My mother was the architect of the family mythology, but my father was the stamp of approval. He did not need to shout. He just needed to sit there, listen to Madison's version, and nod like a judge who had already made up his mind. That was enough. His silence always carried the same message. This is not worth defending yourself over, Emily, because we have already decided who is right. By the time I turned 19, I had started noticing how different I felt outside the house. At work, people thanked me when I helped them. At school, if I said I could not do something, that was usually the end of the discussion. With normal people, a boundary was not an act of betrayal. But every time I came home, it was like stepping back into a script written for a version of me I no longer wanted to play. And that night, when Madison came downstairs with one broken nail held up like evidence that her entire life had been derailed, I think some part of me already knew I was standing at the edge of whatever came next. Because it was never really about the nail. It was about whether I was still willing to be the person they could punish into obedience. Out on that porch, with the storm pushing harder and the windows glowing warm behind me, I realized the answer to that question had changed long before I found the courage to say it out loud. The thing about being the person everyone depends on is that they stop seeing the difference between kindness and access. By the time Madison came downstairs that night waving her hand like she had suffered a personal tragedy, nobody in that house saw me as someone who could choose whether to help. They saw me as an extension of the family, like a wall outlet or a spare charger, something useful that was supposed to work the second they reached for it. I had been sitting at the dining room table with my laptop open, trying to finish a customer support shift before midnight, still wearing the same jeans and sweater I had on from class earlier that afternoon. My headset was half off one ear, there was a mug of tea going cold beside me, and I was counting down the minutes until I could log off and finally breathe. Then Madison stormed down the stairs in a cloud of perfume, hairspray, and panic, holding up one hand with 3 fingers spread apart like she was presenting evidence in court. One of her long white acrylic nails had snapped near the edge, not even all the way off, just enough to ruin the perfect look she had planned for whatever glossy, over-photographed event she thought would define her social life that week. She did not ask whether I was free. She did not ask whether I minded. She said, "Fix it," like she was talking to staff in a hotel. I remember glancing at the clock in the corner of my laptop screen and saying, as evenly as I could, "I cannot right now, I am working." That should have been a complete sentence. In any normal house it would have been. But Madison's entire face changed, not because she was hurt, but because she had encountered resistance. It was the same look she had worn since childhood whenever the universe failed to bend fast enough to meet her. She leaned across the table and said I was being ridiculous, that it would take 5 minutes, that I knew how important tonight was, that if I cared about anyone except myself I would just do it. I told her again that I could not, and this time I added the truth I usually swallowed. Your broken nail is not an emergency. The room went still in that charged way it always did right before everything turned against me. Madison's eyes filled instantly, which would have been impressive if I had not seen the technique about 100 times before. She pressed her lips together, stared at me like I had humiliated her in public, and called for our mother in a voice so wounded you would have thought I had ruined her entire future. My mother appeared from the kitchen drying her hands on a dish towel, already prepared to take Madison's side before she knew the details. She looked at the hand, listened to Madison's version, and then turned to me with that expression I had learned to dread, the one that mixed disappointment with moral superiority. "Emily," she said, "why are you always like this when your sister needs something?" "Always." "Not tonight." "Not right now." "Always." As if one boundary erased years of compliance. I took off my headset and said I was finishing work and that Madison could either fix it herself or leave it alone because nobody at a party was going to collapse over one uneven nail. That was when my mother's tone sharpened. She said it was not about the nail, it was about support, family, attitude, respect. In our house, those words got used like kitchen knives so often and so casually that by the end you barely noticed you had been cut by them. Madison stood there clutching her hand to her chest and adding little comments just often enough to keep the fire going. Saying she knew I hated helping her, saying I always had to make everything difficult, saying I was probably jealous because she actually had somewhere to go. That last part was especially ridiculous, because I had turned down invitations before just to cover responsibilities at home while she floated through life acting too overwhelmed to load a dishwasher. But facts had never mattered much once the family script kicked in. My father finally looked up from the recliner in the living room after hearing enough of the conversation to identify the role he needed to play. He did not ask what happened. He did not ask why I was working. He just said from across the room, "Why is this turning into a fight?" That was his favorite move, pretending conflict appeared out of nowhere the moment I stopped cooperating. I said because I said no to something unreasonable, and that was the exact wrong answer in a house where reason had nothing to do with power. My mother drew herself up like I had confirmed every private suspicion she had ever had about my character. Madison began crying harder. My father stood, crossed into the dining room, and told me I was ruining the evening over something petty. I almost laughed at the word petty because that was the whole point. This was petty. This should have passed in 30 seconds. But in our house, the smaller the original issue, the more determined they were to make my refusal look monstrous. It was never enough for me to disagree. I had to be corrected for it. I had to be made into a warning example. Looking back, I think the real fight started the moment I stayed seated. The moment I did not spring up, apologize, and reach for the nail glue. The moment I let them see clearly that their usual methods were no longer working on me the way they used to. And once that happened, once they sensed they were losing the version of Emily who could be guilted into anything, I think they became far more interested in winning than in being fair. What happened next had almost nothing to do with Madison's nail and everything to do with the ritual my family had perfected over the years, the one where a simple disagreement got turned into a character trial and everyone somehow ended up reciting the same story about me until it sounded official. My mother planted both hands on the back of a dining chair and looked at me with that tight, composed expression she used when she wanted to seem calm enough to make me look irrational by comparison. She said she did not understand why I always had to make everything harder than it needed to be. My father stood beside her like a silent witness for the prosecution. Madison hovered a few feet away with tears sliding carefully down her cheeks, staring at her hand and then at me as if I had personally sabotaged the whole night. If a stranger had walked in at that moment, they probably would have assumed I had done something truly cruel. That was the genius of it, if you can call it that. My family never needed facts. They just needed a familiar arrangement of expressions, tones, and accusations. Once everyone stepped into position, the verdict was already decided. I closed my laptop because I knew there was no chance I was finishing my shift with all three of them bearing down on me. The screen went dark and something about that tiny click felt heavier than it should have. Like I was watching another piece of my own life get pushed aside to make room for Madison's emergency. I asked as calmly as I could, why no one was asking her to solve her own problem. My mother let out a short laugh, not because anything was funny, but because she liked to treat reasonable questions as proof that I was being difficult on purpose. She said, "Emily, normal people help family without turning it into a debate." Normal people. That phrase landed the way it always did, as a warning disguised as common sense. Madison immediately picked up the cue and said she never would have treated me this way if our positions were reversed. Which was such a perfect lie I almost admired the confidence it took to say it out loud. Madison had spent years treating me exactly that way whenever she wanted something, and everyone in the room knew it. But truth had never been the point. The point was to flood the moment with enough emotion that my actual argument got buried under their performance. My father finally spoke again, and when he did, his voice had that measured, disappointed tone he used when he wanted to sound like the only adult in the room. He said he was tired of the constant tension I brought into the house. Not the tension Madison created by demanding things. Not the tension my mother created by escalating every conflict into a moral crisis. My tension. The tension of existing as a person who occasionally said no. I felt that old familiar pressure building in my chest, the one that used to make me back down just to end the scene, but this time I stayed where I was. I told him there would not be any tension if everyone stopped acting like Madison's problems belonged to me. The room went so quiet that even Madison stopped sniffling for a second. My mother's eyes narrowed, and I could practically see the narrative rearranging itself in her head. In less than a heartbeat, I had gone from selfish to disrespectful. She said I sounded bitter. She said I had been acting resentful for months. She said maybe the real issue was that I could not stand not being the center of attention. That one was so upside down it almost made me dizzy. Madison was the one having a family summit over a cosmetic inconvenience, and somehow I was the attention seeker. But that is the thing about living inside a distorted version of reality for long enough. You can know it is absurd and still feel yourself getting pulled toward defending against it. I could hear myself starting to explain, starting to list examples, starting to make the kind of detailed case I had made 1,000 times before, hoping that if I just found the right words they would finally see me clearly. Then I stopped. Because deep down I already knew what I had spent years refusing to admit. They did see me clearly. They just preferred the role they had assigned me. My mother stepped closer and said that if I had any love for my sister at all, I would stop making excuses and help her. Madison folded her arms and looked at me with that smug little tremble around the mouth she got whenever she sensed victory coming. My father said he would not tolerate one more minute of attitude under his roof. Under his roof. There it was again, that reminder that the house was not a home so much as a hierarchy, and my place in it depended on obedience. I could feel the heat rising in my face even as my hands turned cold. I said, quietly but clearly, I am not fixing her nail, and I am not apologizing for saying no. The second the words left my mouth, I knew something had shifted. My mother straightened like she had been handed proof of my moral failure. My father's jaw tightened. Madison stopped pretending to cry and just watched me, openly now like she was waiting to see how harsh the consequence would be. There was no shouting after that, which somehow made everything feel worse. My mother looked at my father. My father looked at the front door. And in that chillingly ordinary silence, I understood that they were not trying to solve a family conflict anymore. They were trying to reestablish control. What happened next was decided with a glance, like they had both been rehearsing it for years and were only waiting for the day I pushed back far enough to make them use it. My father did not raise his voice when he told me to get outside. That was what made it feel so unreal. If he had yelled, if my mother had slammed a hand on the table, if Madison had turned the whole thing into one of her usual shrieking meltdowns, maybe my brain would have recognized it as a fight and reacted faster. But instead it all unfolded with this chilling, orderly calm, as if they were not doing something outrageous at all, just enforcing a household rule I had somehow forgotten. My father pointed toward the front door and said, in the same tone. He might have used to tell me to take out the trash, that I could come back in when I was ready to stop disrespecting the family. My mother stood beside him with her arms folded, lips pressed into that narrow line she wore whenever she wanted to look principled instead of cruel. Madison stayed a few steps back, no longer crying now that things had tipped in her favor, one hand wrapped protectively around the finger with the broken nail as if she were still the injured party in all of this. For a second I honestly thought they were trying to scare me into backing down. I thought if I just sat there and looked at them long enough, one of them would break character and admit this had gone too far. Instead my father told me again, slower this time, to get outside. I asked if he was serious, and my mother answered before he could. She said maybe a little time alone would help me think about how selfish I had become. There was something almost polished about the way she said it, like she had already chosen the version of this story she would tell later if anyone ever asked. I looked from one face to the other, waiting for some hint that this was still fixable, that somebody in that room remembered I was their daughter and not a problem to be managed. I found nothing. My father took one step toward me, not rushing, not dramatic, just final. I stood up because suddenly the room felt smaller than it had a minute earlier. The house was warm, the lights were soft, the kind of cozy winter scene people put in holiday commercials, and yet I had never felt less safe in it. I grabbed my phone from beside the laptop, but I did not even think to grab my coat. That is how unprepared I was for the possibility that they meant it. I kept expecting one of them to stop me before I reached the door. I kept expecting common sense to return like a power outage ending. It did not. My father opened the front door, and the cold came rushing in so hard it stole the breath from my lungs. The wind pushed a swirl of snow into the entryway, and for one stupid second I just stood there staring out at the porch light glowing over a layer of white gathering on the steps, still waiting for someone to say enough. Instead, my mother said from behind me, "You can come back when you are ready to apologize to your sister and act like part of this family." The wording hit me almost as hard as the cold. Not if, when. As though the only question in anyone's mind was how long I would hold out before surrendering. I stepped onto the porch in socks, jeans, and a sweater, the wood already slick with fresh snow under my feet. The door closed behind me with a sound so ordinary it barely registered at first. Then I heard the lock turn. That was the moment the whole thing stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a message. I spun around and grabbed the doorknob immediately, more out of disbelief than panic, but it did not budge. Through the glass I could see the blur of movement inside, my father stepping away, my mother reaching up to adjust the curtain, Madison disappearing back toward the stairs, the crisis apparently resolved now that I had been removed from the scene. I knocked once, then harder, then pressed close enough to the window that my breath fogged the pane and called through the crack at the side that this was not funny. No one answered. The porch light cast everything in a pale yellow wash that made the snow look almost soft, but the wind had teeth now, slicing through the knit of my sweater and finding every inch of exposed skin. My fingers were already starting to sting. My phone battery was under 20% because I had worked most of the evening and forgotten to charge it. I checked the time and saw it was a little after 9:30. Not even late. Neighbors were home. Cars were still passing occasionally on the street beyond the front yard. Somewhere down the block, somebody's Christmas lights were blinking red and green against the storm like nothing in the world was wrong. I remember looking through the window again and catching a glimpse of warm light spilling across the hallway floor. And the thought that came to me was so simple it almost broke me in half. They are comfortable. That was the part one could not get over. Not that they were angry. Not that they were being unfair. But that they had done this and then gone right back to being comfortable. Madison would probably still make her party. My mother would probably tell herself this was tough love. My father would settle back into his chair thinking he had restored order. And I was out there barefoot except for wet socks, breathing air so cold it burned, finally forced to see that to them. My pain had never counted if it made life easier for Madison. Standing on that porch with the storm thickening around me, I realized I had spent years hoping my family would eventually notice what they were doing. That night I understood they had noticed all along. They just did not care enough to stop. At first I stayed on the porch because some stubborn, humiliated part of me still believed they would open the door in a minute or two and pretend this had all been a dramatic misunderstanding. I kept looking at the knob like it might turn on its own if I waited long enough, like the house might remember I belonged to it. But the wind kept pushing harder, carrying little needles of snow across the steps and into the edges of my socks until the fabric felt thin and useless against the cold. My toes had gone from stinging to numb in what could not have been more than a few minutes, and my hands were shaking badly enough that unlocking my phone took 2 tries. I stood with my back against the siding to block some of the wind and stared at the screen, trying to think clearly while the battery icon glowed a depressing shade of red. 19%. No coat, no gloves, no charger, and not enough pride left to pretend I could wait this out. I scrolled through my contacts and hit the first number that made sense, my friend Kayla, who lived about 15 minutes away if the roads were clear. She answered on the second ring with music in the background and laughed when she said hello, because she had no reason to think anything was wrong. The sound nearly undid me. I told her as evenly as I could that I had been locked outside and needed help. There was a beat of silence. Then she said my name in this sharp, disbelieving way and asked what I meant. I repeated it slower because saying it once made it sound ridiculous even to me. My parents locked me outside. It is snowing. I do not have a coat. Her whole tone changed. She told me to stay where I was and said she was getting her keys, but then she asked the question I had been trying not to ask myself. Could I get somewhere warm while she drove over? That was when I finally admitted the porch was not a plan. It was just the place where they had left me. I looked down the street through the blowing snow, trying to gauge which houses had lights on and which neighbors I trusted enough to knock on this late. We had lived on that block for years, but the truth is my mother had never really encouraged closeness with anyone nearby. She liked surface politeness, holiday cards, driveway waves, but not the kind of relationships where people saw too much. Still, 3 houses down lived Mrs. Alvarez, a retired school secretary who always wore bright scarves and remembered everyone's birthday before they did. She had once brought us soup when Madison had the flu and had called me sweetheart ever since I was 16. Her porch light was on. I told Kayla I was going to try there, and she said she was already backing out of her driveway. I shoved the phone into my pocket to save battery and stepped off my porch into the yard. The snow came halfway over the tops of my socks almost instantly, cold soaking through in a way that made my whole body jolt. The walkway was covered, the front lawn a blur of white under the porch light, and I had to move slowly because the concrete underneath was slick. I remember feeling absurdly aware of everything at once: the scrape of frozen grass under my feet, the way my ears hurt, the tightness in my chest every time I inhaled, the warm glow from houses that were not mine. Each step toward Mrs. Alvarez's place felt longer than it should have, like the street had stretched while I was not looking. I kept glancing back at my own house, half expecting someone to come to the door and call me back inside. But the windows stayed golden and still, curtains drawn as if nothing unusual had happened there at all. By the time I reached the Alvarez porch, my fingers were so stiff I could barely curl them into a fist. I knocked once, softly at first, then harder when I realized she might not hear me over the storm. It took maybe 10 seconds for the porch light to brighten and the front door to open a cautious few inches. Mrs. Alvarez peeked out, saw me standing there pale and shaking with snow in my hair, and her whole face changed. "Emily," she said, "what on earth happened to you?" I did not even have a good answer ready. Not one that sounded normal. Not one that sounded survivable. I just stood there with my shoulders hunched and my arms wrapped around myself and said, "Can I come in for a minute?" She opened the door all the way without another question. Warm air rushed over me so suddenly it made my eyes sting. She led me into the entryway, shut the door behind me, and wrapped one of those thick woven throws around my shoulders before I could protest. The house smelled like cinnamon tea and laundry detergent, clean and human and safe in a way mine never had, not really. She took one look at my feet and clicked her tongue under her breath, then told me to sit down while she got towels. I sank onto the bench by the door, clutching that blanket so hard my hands hurt, and for the first time since the lock clicked behind me, I let myself stop pretending I was fine. Not dramatic, not difficult, not overreacting, just cold, shaken, and finally in a house where somebody looked at me and immediately understood that something was very wrong. When Mrs. Alvarez came back with dry towels and a pair of thick wool socks that probably belonged to a relative visiting over Christmas, she knelt in front of me and asked again, much more quietly this time, "Who put you out there?" And in that warm little entryway, with the storm beating at the windows and my own family less than 100 yards away pretending I did not exist, I realized the question was no longer whether what they had done was cruel. The question was what would happen now that somebody else knew. Mrs. Alvarez did not react the way people in my family always did when something ugly had to be named. She did not flinch away from it, minimize it, or start searching for a softer version that would make everyone more comfortable. She just looked at me, really looked at me, with my hair damp from melted snow and my hands still trembling under the blanket, and waited. That steady silence made it harder to hide than any pressure ever could. I told her the truth in pieces at first because saying the whole thing plainly still felt impossible. I said there had been an argument. I said Madison wanted me to do something for her and I refused. I said my parents told me to go outside until I was ready to apologize. Even then, some part of me kept trying to clean the story up, to make it sound less shocking than it was. Mrs. Alvarez was not having it. She folded one of the dry towels over my feet and said, very gently, "Emily, did they know you had no coat on?" I nodded. "Did they lock the door?" I nodded again. Her mouth tightened in a way that told me she was far angrier than she was letting herself sound. Then she stood up and said she was making tea and calling someone. The word someone made my stomach drop. Years of living in my house had trained me to think exposure was the worst possible outcome, that outside eyes meant humiliation, That the real danger in any family crisis was not what had happened but who might find out. I asked her not to call the police, and she paused at the kitchen doorway and asked why that was my first concern instead of the fact that I had just been left outside in a snowstorm. I did not have an answer that did not sound sad. The honest one was that I knew exactly what my mother would say if authorities ever got involved. She would say I was dramatic. She would say I left on my own. She would say they thought I went to cool off for a few minutes and never imagined I would make the family look bad over a misunderstanding. People like my mother always had language ready. They could turn cruelty into discipline, neglect into tough love, and public embarrassment into victimhood so fast it made your head spin. Mrs. Alvarez listened without interrupting, then said something no adult had ever said to me before. She said, even if they explain it away later, that does not change what they chose to do. I think that was the moment I started to understand the power of being seen by somebody who did not already have a role for me to play. She was not asking whether I had been respectful enough, calm enough, cooperative enough to deserve compassion. She was starting from the assumption that being left outside in freezing weather was wrong, period. Kayla arrived a few minutes later with snow still dusting the shoulders of her coat, and her car running at the curb. The second she stepped into the house and saw me wrapped in a blanket on the bench by the entryway, her expression went from worried to furious. She asked if I wanted to come stay with her family, and that offer hit me with a force I was not prepared for because it was so immediate, so uncomplicated. No lecture. No conditions. No reminder of what I supposedly owed in exchange for shelter. Just come with me. Before I could answer, my phone buzzed in my hand, and the screen lit up with my mother's name. Not a text. A call. I stared at it until it stopped ringing and then buzzed again almost immediately. This time there was a voicemail notification a few seconds later, then another call from Madison, then one from my father. It was almost funny how quickly I became worth contacting once I was no longer standing helplessly on their porch. Kayla glanced at the screen and said, "Do not answer them yet." Mrs. Alvarez agreed. She set a mug of tea in front of me and said that if my parents had suddenly realized I was missing, that was their emergency to manage, not mine. I wish I could say I absorbed that wisdom instantly, but my body was still running on the old programming. Part of me wanted to answer just to de-escalate things, just to make sure my mother was not angry enough to invent something worse by the time I got home. Then my phone buzzed again with a text, and everything inside me went still. It was from Madison. Said, "You are being insane. Come home and stop. Embarrassing everyone. Not, are you okay? Not, mom is worried. Not even a fake apology wrapped in manipulation. Just annoyance that I had created inconvenience by refusing to disappear quietly." I showed the message to Kayla and Mrs. Alvarez, and for the first time that night I watched other people read my family's behavior exactly the way it deserved to be read. Kayla let out a disbelieving laugh and said, "Your sister is unbelievable." Mrs. Alvarez did not laugh at all. She told me to save every message. Then she asked if there was anyone in the family who was safer than the people in that house. An aunt, a grandparent, anyone. I thought of my mother's older sister, Aunt Denise, who lived about 40 minutes away and had spent years in low-grade conflict with my mother over things no one ever fully explained to me. My mother called her judgmental. Denise called my mother controlling. At the time, I had always assumed the truth was somewhere in the middle, because that was what children from tense homes learned to believe. Now I was not so sure. I hesitated before giving Mrs. Alvarez her number, and she noticed. She said, "Sweetheart, decent people do not leave their child outside because of an argument. You do not have to protect this." That sentence cut through something deep. I had spent so long acting as the translator for my family, forever softening their words, justifying their actions, explaining away what should have been obvious. Sitting there in borrowed socks with my phone lighting up over and over beside a mug of untouched tea, I realized the story had already left the house, even if only by a few feet. It was in another person's mouth now, another person's judgment. And once that happened, once someone unconnected to the family had seen me and heard what happened and called it wrong without hesitation, the whole structure my parents relied on began to feel less permanent than it ever had before. Mrs. Alvarez called Aunt Denise before I could change my mind, and the contrast between that conversation and the ones I was used to hearing in my own house was so stark it almost made me dizzy. She did not circle the issue or soften it into something more polite. She said, clearly and calmly, that Emily was at her house, that there had been a family incident, and that I had been left outside in the snow without proper winter clothes. There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp, furious voice I had not heard in months saying, "I am on my way." That was it. No interrogation about what I might have done to cause it. No lecture about family harmony. No immediate defense of my parents. Just belief followed by action. In the time it took Denise to get there, the messages from my family kept coming, and each one felt like a little window into what mattered most to them. My mother left a voicemail saying I needed to stop making a scene and come home immediately so we could discuss this privately. My father sent a short text saying, "Enough. Get back here." Madison sent another message asking if I had any idea how much stress I was causing before her event. That one actually made Kayla laugh out loud in the Alvarez kitchen. A sharp, stunned laugh that held no humor at all. I looked at the glowing screen in my hand and had one of those strange, clarifying moments where a lifetime of confusion suddenly organizes itself into something obvious. None of them were worried about me. They were worried about losing control of the story. They knew, whether they admitted it or not, that the second I stepped into another person's house with snow in my hair and no coat on, this stopped being a family disagreement and started looking exactly like what it was. Mrs. Alvarez told me again to save everything, so I took screenshots of the texts and emailed them to myself, my fingers finally warm enough to move without shaking. That small act felt more important than it should have, like I was preserving evidence not just of one night but of a pattern I had spent years being told was too vague, too emotional, too complicated to prove. Denise arrived in under half an hour, still in her work slacks and boots, coat half-zipped, expression set in a way that made her look 10 years younger and 20 times more dangerous. The second she saw me on the bench with the blanket around my shoulders, her face changed from anger to something quieter and sadder, and I knew instantly that she had suspected more about my home life than I ever realized. She crouched in front of me and asked if I was all right, and I told her I was cold, embarrassed, and not going back there tonight. She nodded like she had expected that answer. Then she stood up, held out her hand for my phone, and asked if I had gotten anything in writing. I handed it over. She read the messages one by one, her mouth tightening further with each screen, and then she did something I do not think anyone had ever done for me before. She got angry on my behalf without making me manage her reaction. She did not collapse into drama. She did not demand I comfort her. She just became very still and very focused. She asked Mrs. Alvarez if she would mind staying with me for a few more minutes, then told Kayla to keep my tea warm because we were going to need a minute. Before I could ask what she meant, Denise walked to the front window, looked out across the snowy yards toward my house and said, "They do not get to rewrite this before I get there." She crossed the street in boots built for weather and boundaries, and for the first time all night, I did not feel like the only person standing between myself and my family's version of reality. Through the Alvarez front window I could not hear what was being said, but I could see the whole scene unfold in fragments under the porch light. My father opened the door with the posture of a man expecting authority and getting it. Then he saw Denise. My mother appeared behind him a few seconds later, one hand pressed dramatically to her chest. Even from across the street I could tell she had slipped into her public voice, the one that sounded composed and wounded at the same time. Denise did not step inside. She stayed on the porch. That alone told me everything. She was not entering their frame. She was making them answer within everyone else's view. My father tried talking first. Denise cut him off. My mother folded her arms. Denise took out her phone, probably showing them the messages. Madison came into the hallway behind them still dressed for her party, and even at a distance I could recognize the irritated tilt of her head. Then came the moment I think changed the entire night. Mrs. Alvarez, who had been standing beside me at the window with her own arms crossed, quietly said, "There is the Johnson boy across the street coming home." And sure enough, headlights swept along the curb while a neighbor pulled into his driveway and glanced toward the scene on my parents' porch. A minute later another porch light flicked on next door. The private theater my family depended on had walls now made of windows, and windows can work both ways. Suddenly they were not just three people enforcing their version of normal inside a sealed house. They were a mother, a father, and a favored daughter trying to explain why their other daughter had ended up in a neighbor's entryway, wrapped in a blanket on a night when the temperature was dropping into the teens. Even without hearing a word, I could see their confidence changing. My father's shoulders lost that rigid certainty. My mother started gesturing too much, which she always did when the facts were not on her side. Madison disappeared from the hallway. Denise did not move. When she finally turned and came back across the street, there was snow gathering on her hair and a look on her face that was both grim and strangely satisfied. She stepped inside, closed the door against the storm, and said the words that split the night cleanly in two. She said, "They know this cannot be hidden now." And in that instant, with my family's story cracking under the weight of witnesses, screenshots, and somebody brave enough to refuse their script, the balance of power shifted for the first time in my life. Denise did not let the silence settle after that. She took off her coat, set it over the back of a kitchen chair, and told me exactly what my parents had said on the porch, not to upset me, but to make one thing unmistakably clear. They were not denying that I had been put outside. They were trying to reframe it. My father claimed I had stormed out on my own, and that they had only locked the door later because they thought I had left for the night. My mother said they never imagined I would go to a neighbor's house instead of cooling off for a few minutes and coming back when I was ready to apologize. Denise repeated those excuses in a flat voice, then looked directly at me and said, "Emily, none of that matches the messages they sent after." That was the part that mattered. Once the words were placed beside the evidence, their story collapsed under its own convenience. If they thought I had chosen to leave, why was my father ordering me to come back and stop causing problems? If they believed I was safe and simply taking space, why was my mother demanding we handle it privately before anyone else got involved? If Madison thought this was all a misunderstanding, why was her first instinct to accuse me of embarrassing everyone instead of asking whether I was all right? Denise said what I had not quite been able to say to myself yet. They were not confused, they were scrambling. And scrambling meant they knew. The room felt very still after that. Kayla sat across from me with both hands wrapped around her mug. Mrs. Alvarez leaned against the counter, watchful and quiet. Outside, the snow kept falling in soft dense sheets that made the street glow under the lamps, and everything about the night looked peaceful except the truth of it. Denise asked me the question no one in my family had ever really asked before. She said, "What do you want to do now?" Not what should happen. Not what would keep the peace. Not what would make the family look better by morning. What do you want? I think if she had asked me that a year earlier, I would have frozen. I had spent so long adapting myself to other people's reactions that I barely recognized my own preferences, unless they came disguised as survival. But something about that night had burned through the fog. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the locked door. Maybe it was finally seeing strangers react to my family, the way I had secretly always hoped someone would. Whatever it was, the answer came out clean. I said I did not want to go back tonight, and I did not want to keep living like this after tonight either. Denise nodded once, as if she had been waiting for me to catch up to a conclusion she had reached long ago. She said I could stay with her as long as I needed. She said we would get my things tomorrow, not tonight, not in the middle of a storm and not on my parents' emotional terms. She said if they wanted to talk, they could do it through her until I decided otherwise. That last part hit me with almost physical force. Through her. A boundary. A gate. A person standing between me and the version of reality I had been forced to negotiate inside for years. My phone buzzed again on the table, but this time I did not jump. Denise looked at the screen, saw my mother's name, and turned the phone face down without even asking. It should not have felt revolutionary, that tiny motion, but it did. It felt like watching someone close a door that had never properly closed before. I ended up leaving the Alvarez house close to 11:30, bundled in Denise's spare winter coat and a pair of gloves from her car, carrying my dead laptop in one hand and my nearly dead phone in the other. Kayla hugged me before we left and told me to call her no matter what time it was. Mrs. Alvarez pressed a paper bag of muffins into my hand like I was heading off to college instead of just across town, and when I thanked her, she touched my cheek and said very firmly, "None of this was your fault." I do not think she will ever fully understand what it meant to hear that at the exact moment I was leaving the street where I had spent years being trained to doubt myself. Denise drove carefully through the storm while I stared out the passenger window at the white blur of parking lots, gas stations, and dark storefronts slipping past. Every few miles, my phone lit up again with another call or text from home, and every time it did, I felt less fear than the last. By the time we reached Denise's apartment, The panic had drained out of me and left something colder, steadier, and much more useful behind. Clarity. The next morning my mother sent a long message about how heartbroken she was that I had chosen to humiliate the family over a misunderstanding. My father followed with one about respect, responsibility, and how I had let outsiders poison the situation. Madison sent nothing at all until late afternoon, when she asked if I knew where her silver clutch was because she thought I might have moved it the week before. That message, more than anything else, told me I was done. Not angry for one night. Not waiting for a better apology. Done. Denise went with me later that day to collect my things. My parents tried every version of the story when we arrived. My mother cried. My father spoke in that stern, practiced tone he used when he wanted to sound like the victim of youthful ingratitude. Madison avoided me completely. But the house did not feel the same anymore. It had lost the sealed quality it used to have, the sense that whatever happened inside could be renamed before it reached the outside world. Too many people knew. Too much had been said in writing. And I had spent one night beyond their reach and discovered that life outside their script was not only possible, it was easier to breathe in. I packed clothes, documents, my laptop charger, an old photo box, the few things that had ever felt like mine, and I left without arguing. That was the part my mother could not understand. She kept pushing for one more conversation, one more round where she could twist the language until I doubted myself again. I did not give it to her. I just told her I would be in touch when I was ready, and for once I meant the words exactly as I said them. No hidden plea. No fear underneath. Just truth. They locked me out because they thought cold, shame, and obedience still belonged together in me. They thought I would come back smaller, apologetic, ready to earn my way into the warmth again. What they did not understand was that the door they locked that night was not the one that mattered most. The one that finally closed was the one inside me. The one that had stayed open for years waiting for them to become the family I deserved. And once that door shut, it did not matter how brightly the house glowed behind them. I was never stepping back into that version of home again.